see the cover of this book, here's what it looks like. The coat of the Woosters. There's Bertie in front and Jeeves behind. Here's the cover. Hello, Alex. We will start in about 10 seconds. In which case, I'll put my hair back up. And there we go. All right. So let us recap from last night. So yesterday, in our introduction to Jeeves and Wooster in this particular volume, which is not the first, but is as good an introduction as any, Bertie Wooster has had rather an interesting week. He was supposed to go and sneer at a cow creamer for his Aunt Dahlia, who has the most amazing cook, Anatole. However, said cow creamer has been snatched up by the insidious, what's his name? Sir Watkin Bassett. So, Bertie's in the soup. His aunt is sending him off to Totley Towers, and his friend Gussie Finknottle has also requested his presence at Totley Towers to intervene in the matter of his marriage or the pending disaster to his impending marriage between Gussie Finknottle and Madeline Bassett. So, there we are. Bertie and Jeeves are on their way to Totley Towers, and Bertie has two tasks. One, to reconcile Gussie and Madeline to themselves, and the other to steal that dratted cow creamer. Man and boy, Jeeves, I said, breaking a thoughtful silence which had lasted for about 87 miles. I have been in some tough spots in my time, but this one wins the mottled oyster. We were bowling along in the old two-seater on our way to Totley Towers, self at the wheel, Jeeves at my side, the personal effects in the dicky. We had got off round about 11:30, and the genial afternoon was now at its juiciest. It was one of those crisp, sunny, bracing days with a pleasant tang in the air, and had circumstances been different from what they were, I should no doubt have been feeling at the peak of my form, chatting gaily, waving to passing rustics, possibly even singing some light snatch. Unfortunately, however, if there was one thing circumstances weren't, it was different from what they were, and there was no suspicion of a song on the lips. The more I thought of what lay before me at these bally towers, the bowed downer did the heart become. The mottled oyster, I repeated. Sir? I frowned. The man was being discreet, and this was no time for discretion. Don't pretend you don't know all about it, Jeeves, I said coldly. You were in the next room throughout my interview with Aunt Dahlia, and her remarks must have been audible in Piccadilly. He dropped the mask. Well, yes, sir. I must confess that I did gather the substance of the conversation. Very well, then. You agree with me that the situation is a lulu? Certainly a somewhat sharp crisis in your affairs would appear to have been precipitated, sir. I drove on, brooding. If I had my life to live again, Jeeves, I would start it as an orphan without any aunts. Don't they put aunts in Turkey in sacks and drop them in the Bosphorus? Odalisks, sir, I understand, not aunts. Well, why not aunts? Look at the trouble they cause in the world. I tell you, Jeeves, and you may quote me as saying this, behind every poor, innocent, harmless blighter who's going down for the third time in the soup, you will find, if you look carefully enough, the aunt who shoved him in. There is much in what you say, sir. It is no use telling me that there are bad aunts and good aunts. At the core, they are all alike. Sooner or later, out pops the cloven hoof. Consider this Dahlia, Jeeves. As sound an egg as ever cursed a foxhound for chasing a rabbit. I have always considered her. And she goes and hands me an assignment like this. Wooster, the pincher of policemen's helmets, we know. We are familiar with Wooster, the supposed bag snatcher. But it was left for this aunt to present to the world a Wooster who goes to the houses of retired magistrates and while eating their bread and salt, swipes their cow creamers. Faugh, I said, for I was a good deal overwrought. F-A-U-G-H, in case you're wondering what faugh is. Most disturbing, sir. I wonder how old Bassett will receive me, Jeeves. It will be interesting to observe his reactions, sir. He can't very well throw me out, I suppose, Miss Bassett having invited me. No, sir. On the other hand, he can, and I think he will, look at me over the top of his pince-nez and make rummy sniffing noises. The prospect is not an agreeable one. No, sir. I mean to say, even if this cow creamer thing had not come up, conditions would be sticky. Yes, sir. Might I venture to inquire if it is your intention to endeavour to carry out Mrs. Travers' wishes? You can't fling the hands up in a passionate gesture when you're driving a car at 50 miles an hour. Otherwise, I should have done so. That's the problem with torturing me, Jeeves. I can't make up my mind. You remember that fellow you've mentioned to me once or twice, who let something wait upon something? You know who I mean, the cat chap. Macbeth, sir, a character in a play of that name by the late William Shakespeare. He was described as letting I dare not wait upon I would, like the poor cat is the adage. Well, that is how it is with me. I wobble and I vacillate, if that's the word. Perfectly correct, sir. I think of being barred from those menus of Anatoles, and I say to myself that I will take a pop. Then I reflect that my name at Totley Towers is already mud, and that old Bassett is firmly convinced that I am a combination of Raffles and a pea and thimble man, and steal everything I come upon that isn't nailed down. Sir, didn't I tell you about that? I had another encounter with him yesterday, the worst to date. He now looks upon me as the dregs of the criminal world, if not public enemy number 1, certainly number 2 or 3. I informed him briefly of what had occurred, and conceived my emotion when I saw that he appeared to be finding something humorous in the recital. Jeeves does not often smile, but now a distinct simper had begun to wreathe his lips. A laughable misunderstanding, sir. Laughable, Jeeves. He saw that his mirth had been ill-timed. He reassembled the features, ironing out the smile. I beg your pardon, sir. I should have said disturbing. Quite. It must have been exceedingly trying, meeting Sir Watkin in such circumstances. Yes, and it's going to be a dashed sight more trying if he catches me pinching his cow creamer. I keep seeing a vision of him doing it. I quite understand, sir, and thus the native view of resolution is sickly raw with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pitch and moment in this regard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. Exactly. You take the words out of my mouth. I drove on, brooding more than ever. And here's another point that presents itself, Jeeves. Even if I want to steal cow creamers, How am I going to find the time? It isn't a thing you can just take in your stride. You have to plan and plot and lay schemes, and I shall need every ounce of concentration for this business of Gussie's. Exactly, sir. One appreciates the difficulties. And as if that wasn't enough to have on my mind, there's that telegram of Stiffy's. You remember the second telegram that came this morning? It was from Miss Stephanie Byng, Miss Bassett's cousin who resides at Totley Towers. You've met her. She came to lunch at the flat a week or two ago. Smallish girl of about the tonnage of Maureen O'Sullivan. Oh yes, I remember Miss Byng. A charming young lady. Quite. But what does she want me to do for her? That's the question. Probably something completely unfit for human consumption. So I've got to worry about that, too. What a life. Yes, sir. Still, stiff upper lip, I suppose, Jeeves, what? Precisely, sir. During these exchanges we had been breezing along at a fairish pace, but I had not failed to note that on a signpost which we had passed some little while back there had been inscribed the words, Totley in the Wold, 8 miles. There now appeared before us through the trees a stately home of E. Yes, England, presumably. I braked the car. Journey's end, Jeeves? So I should be disposed to imagine, sir. And so it proved. Having turned in at the gateway and fetched up at the front door, we were informed by the butler that this was indeed the lair of Sir Watkin Bassett. Child Roland to the Dark Tower came, sir, said Jeeves, as we alighted, though what he meant I hadn't unearthly, responding with a briefly, "Oh, ah." I gave my attention to the butler, who was endeavouring to communicate something to me. What he was saying, I now gathered, was that if desirous of mixing immediately with the inmates, I had chosen a bad moment for hitting the place. Sir Watkin, he explained, had popped out for a breather. I fancy he is somewhere in the grounds with Mr. Roderick Spode. I started. After that adventure at the antique shop, the name Roderick was, as you may imagine, rather deeply graven on my heart. Roderick Spode, big chap with a small moustache and the sort of eye that can open an oyster at 60 paces? Yes, he arrived yesterday with Sir Watkin from London. They went out shortly after lunch. Miss Madeline, I believe, is at home, but it may take some little time to locate her. How about Mr. Finknottle? I think he has gone for a walk, sir. Oh, well, righto, then I'll just potter about for a bit. I was glad of the chance of being alone for a while, for I wished to brood. I strolled off along the terrace, doing so. The news that Roderick Spode was on the premises had shaken me a good deal. I had supposed him to be some mere club acquaintance of old Bassett's, who confined his activities exclusively to the metropolis, and his presence at the Towers rendered the prospect of trying to carry out Aunt Dahlia's commission always one calculated to unnerve the stoutest, twice as intimidating as it had been before, when I had supposed that I should be under the personal eye of Sir Watkin alone. Well, you can see that for yourself, I mean to say. Imagine how some unfortunate master criminal would feel on coming down to do a murder at the old Grange if he found that not only was Sherlock Holmes putting in the weekend there, but Hercule Poirot as well. The more I faced up to the idea of pinching that cow creamer, the less I liked it. It seemed to me that there ought to be a middle course, and that what I had to do was explore avenues, in the hope of finding some formula. To this end, I paced the terrace with bent bean, pondering. Old Bassett, I noted, had laid out his money to excellent advantage. I'm a bit of a connoisseur of country houses, and I found this one well up to sample. Nice facade, spreading grounds, smoothly shaven lawns, and a general atmosphere of what is known as old-world peace. Cows were mooing in the distance, sheep and birds respectively bleating and tootling, and from somewhere near at hand there came the report of a gun, indicating that someone was having a whirl at the local rabbits. Totley Towers might be a place where man was vile, but undoubtedly every prospect pleased. As I was strolling up and down, trying to calculate how long it would have taken the old bounder, finding, say, 20 people a day, 5 quid apiece, to collect enough to pay for all this, when my attention was arrested by the interior of a room on the ground floor, visible through an open French window. It was a sort of minor drawing room, if you know what I mean, and it gave the impression of being over-furnished. This was due to the fact that it was stuffed to bursting point with glass cases, these in their turn stuffed to bursting point with silver. It was evident that I was looking at the Bassett collection. I paused. Something seemed to draw me through the French window, and the next moment there I was, vis-a-vis, as the expression is, with my old pal, the silver cow. It was standing in a smallish case over by the door, and I peered in at it, breathing heavily on the glass. It was with considerable emotion that I perceived that the case was not locked. I turned the handle. I dipped in and fished it out. Now, whether it was my intention merely to inspect and examine, or whether I was proposing to shoot the works, I do not know. The nearest I can remember is that I had no really settled plans. My frame of mind was more or less that of a cat in an adage. However, I was not accorded leisure to review my emotions in what Jeeves would call the final analysis, for at this moment a voice behind me said, "Hands up!" And turning, I observed Roderick Spode in the window. He had a shotgun in his hand, and this he was pointing in a negligent sort of way at my third waistcoat button. I gathered from his manner that he was one of those fellows who like firing from the hip. I described Roderick Spode to the butler as a man with an eye that could open an oyster at 60 paces, and it was an eye of this nature that he was directing at me now. He looked like a dictator on the point of starting a purge, and I saw that I had been mistaken in supposing him to be 7 feet in height, 8 at least, and also the slowly working jaw muscles. I hoped he was not going to say, "Ha!" but he did, and as I had not yet mastered the vocal cord sufficiently to be able to reply, that concluded the dialogue sequence for the moment. Then, still keeping his eyes glued on me, he shouted, "Sir Watkin!" There was a distant sound of, yes, here I am, what is it, Ing?" "Come here, please, I have something to show you." Old Bassett appeared in the window, adjusting his pince-nez. I had seen this man before only in the decent habiliments suitable to the metropolis, and I confess that even in the predicament in which I found myself, I was able to shudder at the spectacle he presented in the country. It is of course an axiom, as I have heard Jeeves call it, that the smaller the man, the louder the check suit, and old Bassett's apparel was in keeping with his lack of inches. Prismatic is the only word for those frightful tweeds, and oddly enough, the spectacle of them had the effect of steadying my nerves. They gave me the feeling that nothing mattered. "Look," said Spode, "would you have thought such a thing possible?" Old Bassett was goggling at me with a sort of stunned amazement. "Good God, it's the bag snatcher!" "Yes, isn't it incredible?" "It's unbelievable. Why, damn it, it's persecution. Fellow follows me everywhere, like Mary's lamb. Never a free moment. How did you catch him?" "I happened to be coming along the drive, and I saw a furtive figure slink in at the window. I hurried up and covered him with my gun. Just in time. He had already begun to loot the place." "Well, I'm most obliged to you, Roderick, but what I can't get over is this chap's pertinacity. You would have thought that when we foiled that attempt of his in the Brompton Road, he would have given up the thing as a bad job. But no, down he comes here next day. Well, he will be sorry he did." "I suppose this is too serious a case for you to deal with summarily?" "I can issue a warrant for his arrest. Bring him along to the library and I'll do it now. The case will have to go to the assizes or the sessions." "What will he get, do you think?" "Not easy to say, but certainly not less than—" "Oi!" I said. I'd intended to speak in a quiet, reasonable voice, going on, after I had secured their attention, to explain that I was on these premises as an invited guest. But for some reason the word came out like something Aunt Dahlia might have said to a fellow member of the Pytchley 1/2 a mile away across a ploughed field, and old Bassett shot back as if he'd been jabbed in the eye with a burned stick. Spode commented on my methods of voice production. "Don't shout like that." "Nearly broke my eardrum," grumbled old Bassett. "But listen," I yelled. "Will you listen?" A certain amount of confused argument then ensued, Self trying to put the case for the defence, and the opposition rather harping a bit on the row I was making. And in the middle of it all, just as I was showing myself in particularly good voice, the door opened and somebody said, "Goodness gracious!" I looked round. Those parted lips, those saucer-like eyes, that slender figure drooping slightly at the hinges. Madeline Bassett was in our midst. "Goodness gracious," she repeated. I can well imagine that a casual observer, if I had confided to him my qualms at the idea of being married to this girl, would have raised his eyebrows and been at a loss to understand. "Bertie," he would probably have said, "you don't know what's good for you," adding, possibly, that he wished he had half my complaint. For Madeline Bassett was undeniably of attractive exterior, slim, svelte, if that's the word, and bountifully equipped with golden hair and all the fixings. But where the casual observer would have been making his bloomer was in overlooking that squashy soupiness of hers, that subtle air she had on being on the point of talking baby talk. It was that froze the blood. She was definitely the sort of girl who put her hands over her husband's eyes as he is crawling into breakfast with a morning head and says, "Guess who?" I once stayed at the residence of a newly married pal of mine, and his bride had carved in large letters over the fireplace in the drawing room, where it was quite impossible to miss it, the legend, "Two lovers built this nest." And I can still recall the look of dumb anguish in the other half of the sketch's eyes every time he came in and saw it. Whether Madeline Bassett, on entering the marital state, would go to such an awful extreme I could not say, but it seemed most probable. She was looking at us with a sort of pretty wide-eyed wonder. "Whatever is all the noise about?" she said. "Why, Bertie, when did you get here?" "Oh, hello, I've just arrived." "Did you have a nice journey down?" "Oh, rather, thanks. I came in the two-seater." "You must be quite exhausted." "Oh, no, thanks, rather not." "Well, tea will be ready soon. I see you've met Daddy." "Yes, I've met Daddy." "And Mr. Spode?" "And Mr. Spode." "I don't know where Augustus is, but he's sure to be in to tea." "I'll count the moments." Old Bassett had been listening to these courtesies with a dazed expression on the map, gulping a bit from time to time, like a fish that has been hauled out of a pond on a bent pin, and isn't at all sure it is equal to the pressure of events. One followed the mental processes, of course. To him, Bertram was a creature of the underworld who stole bags and umbrellas, and what made it worse, didn't even steal them well. No father likes to see his ewe lamb on chummy terms with such a one. "You don't mean you know this man?" he said. Madeline Bassett laughed the tinkling silvery laugh which was one of the things that had got her so disliked by the better element. "Why, Daddy, you're too absurd. Of course I know him. Bertie Wooster is a very dear old friend of mine. I told you he was coming here today." Old Bassett seemed not abreast. Spode didn't seem any too abreast either. "Is it your friend Mr. Wooster?" "Of course." "But he snatches bags." "Umbrellas," prompted Spode, as if he had been the king's remembrancer or something. "And umbrellas," assented old Bassett, "and makes daylight raids on antique shops." Madeline was not abreast, making 3 in all. "Daddy?" Old Bassett stuck to it stoutly. "He does, I tell you. I've caught him at it." "I've caught him at it," said Spode. "We've both caught him at it," said old Bassett. "All over London. Whenever you go in London, there you will find this fellow stealing bags and umbrellas, and now in the heart of Gloucestershire." "Nonsense," said Madeline. I saw that it was time to put an end to all this rot. I was about fed up with that bag-snatching stuff. Naturally, one does not expect a magistrate to have all the details about the customers at his fingers' ends. Pretty good, of course, remembering his clientele at all, but one can't just keep passing a thing like that off tactfully. "Of course it's nonsense," I thundered. "The whole thing is one of those laughable misunderstandings." I must say I was expecting that my explanation would go better than it did. What I had anticipated was that after a few words from myself outlining the situation, there would have been roars of jolly mirth, followed by apologies and backslappings. But old Bassett, like so many of these police court magistrates, was a difficult man to convince. Magistrates' natures soon get warped. He kept interrupting and asking questions, and cocking an eye at me as he asked them. You know what I mean, questions beginning with, "Just one moment," and "You say," and "Then you are asking us to believe." Offensive, very. However, after a good deal of tedious spade work, I managed to get him straight on the umbrella, and he conceded that he might have judged me unjustly about that. "But how about the bags?" "There weren't any bags." "I certainly sentenced you for something at Bosher Street. I remember it vividly." I pinched a policeman's helmet. That's just as bad as snatching bags. Roderick Spode intervened unexpectedly. Throughout this, well, dash it, this absolute trial of Mary Dugan, he had been standing by, thoughtfully sucking the muzzle of his gun and listening to my statements as if he thought it all pretty thin. But now a flicker of human feeling came into his granite face. "No," he said, "I don't think you can go as far as that. When I was at Oxford, I once stole a policeman's helmet myself." I was astounded. Nothing in my relations with this man had given me the idea that he, too, had, so to speak, once lived in Arcady. It just showed, as I often say, that there is good in the worst of us. Old Bassett was plainly taken aback. Then he perked up. "Well, how about that affair at the antique shop? Hey, didn't we catch him in the act of running off with my cow creamer? What has he got to say to that?" Spode seemed to see the force of this. He removed the gun which he had placed between his lips and nodded. "The bloke at the shop had given it me to look at," I said shortly. "He advised me to take it outside where the light was better." "You were rushing out." "Staggering out. I trod on the cat." "What cat?" "It appeared to be an animal attached to the personnel of the Emporium." I saw no cat. Did you see a cat, Roderick?" "No, no cat." "Ah, well, we will pass over the cat." "But I didn't," I said, with one of my lightning flashes. "We will pass over the cat," repeated old Bassett, ignoring the gag and leaving it lying there. "And come to another point. What were you doing with that cow creamer? You say you were looking at it. You're asking us to believe that you were merely subjecting it to a perfectly innocent scrutiny. Why? What was your motive? What possible interest could it have for a man like you?" "Exactly," said Spode. "The very question I was going to ask myself." This bit of backing up from a pal had the worst effect on old Bassett. It encouraged him to so great an extent that he now yielded completely to the illusion that he was back in his bally police court. "You say that the proprietor of the shop handed it to you. I put it to you that you snatched it up and were making off with it. And now Mr. Spode catches you here with the thing in your hands. How do you explain that? What's your answer to that, eh?" "Why, Daddy," said Madeline, "I dare say you have been wondering at this pancake silence during all the cut and thrust stuff which had been going on. It is readily explained. What had occurred was that shortly after saying 'nonsense' in the early portion of the proceedings, she had happened to inhale some form of insect life, and since then had been choking quietly in the background. And as the situation was far too tense for us to pay any attention to choking girls, she had been left to carry on under her own steam while the men threshed out the subject on the agenda paper." Showing its age a bit there. She now came forward, her eyes still watering a bit. "Why, Daddy," she said, "naturally your silver will be the first thing Bertie wants to look at. Of course he's interested in it. Bertie is Mr. Travers' nephew." "What?" "Didn't you know that? Your uncle has a wonderful collection, hasn't he, Bertie? I suppose he's often spoken to you of Daddy's." There was a pause. Old Bassett was breathing heavily. I didn't like the look of him at all. He glanced from me to the cow creamer, and from the cow creamer to me, then back from me to the cow creamer again, and it would have taken a far less astute observer than Bertram to fail to read what was passing in his mind. If I ever saw Bimbo engaged in putting two and two together, that Bimbo was Sir Watkin Bassett. "Oh," he said. Just that, nothing more. But it was enough. "I say," I said, "could I send a telegram?" "You can telephone it from the library," said Madeline. "I'll take you there." She conducted me to the instrument and left me, saying that she would be waiting in the hall when I had finished. I leapt at it, established connection with the post office, and after a brief conversation with what appeared to be the village idiot, telephoned as follows. "Mrs. Travers, 47 Charles Street, Berkeley Square, London." I paused for a moment, assembled the ideas, then proceeded thus. "Deeply regret, quite impossible carry out assignment you-know-what. Atmosphere one of keenest suspicion, and any sort of action instantly fatal. You ought to have seen old Bassett's eye just now on learning of blood relationship of self and Uncle Tom. Like ambassador finding veiled woman snooping round safe containing secret treaty. Sorry and all that, but nothing doing. Love, Bertie." I then went down the hall to join Madeline Bassett. She was standing by the barometer, which, if it had an ounce of sense in its head, would have been pointing to stormy instead of set fair. and as I hove alongside she turned and gazed at me with a tender goggle which sent a thrill of dread creeping down the Woosters spine. The thought that there stood one who was on distant terms with Gussie and might ere long return the ring and presents afflicted me with a nameless horror. I resolved that if a few quiet words from a man of the world could heal the breach, they should be spoken. "Oh, Bertie," she said, in a low voice like beer trickling out of a jug, "you ought not to be here." My recent interview with old Bassett and Roderick Spode had rather set me thinking along those lines myself. But I hadn't had time to explain that this was no idle social visit, and that if Gussie hadn't been sending out SOSs, I wouldn't have dreamed of coming within 100 miles of the frightful place. She went on, looking at me as if I were a rabbit which she was expecting shortly to turn into a gnome. "Why did you come? Oh, I know what you're going to say. You felt that cost what it might, you had to see me again just once. You could not resist the urge to take away with you one last memory, which you could cherish down the lonely years. Oh, Bertie, you remind me of Rudel." The name was new to me. Rudel? "The Seigneur Geoffrey Rudel, Prince of Blaye-en-Saintonge." I shook my head. "Never met him, I'm afraid. Pal of yours?" "He lived in the Middle Ages. He was a great poet, and he fell in love with the wife of the Lord of Tripoli." I stirred uneasily. I hoped she was going to keep it clean. "For years he loved her, and at last he could no longer resist. He took ship to Tripoli, and his servants carried him ashore." "Not feeling so good?" I said, groping. "Rough crossing?" "He was dying of love." "Oh. Ah." "They bore him into the Lady Melisandre's presence on a litter, and he had just strength enough to reach out and touch her hand. Then he died." She paused and heaved a sigh that seemed to come straight up from the cami knickers. A silence ensued. "Terrific," I said, feeling I had to say something, though personally I didn't think the story a patch on the one about the travelling salesman and the farmer's daughter. Different, of course, if one had known the chap. She sighed again. "You see now why I said you reminded me of Rudel. Like him, you came to take one last glimpse of the woman you loved. It was dear of you, Bertie, and I shall never forget it. It will always remain with me as a fragrant memory, like a flower pressed between the leaves of an old album. But was it wise? Should you not have been strong? Would it not have been better to have ended it all cleanly that day when we said goodbye at Brinkley Manor, and not to have reopened the wound? We had met, and you had loved me, and I had had to tell you that my heart was another's. That should have been our farewell." "Absolutely," I said. "I mean to say that all that was perfectly sound as far as it went. If her heart really was another's, fine. Nobody more pleased than Bertram. The whole nub of the thing was it? But I had a communication from Gussie, more or less indicating that you and he were..." She looked at me like someone who had just solved the crossword puzzle with a shrewd emu in the top right corner. "So that's why you came. You thought that there might still be hope. Oh, Bertie, I'm sorry, so sorry." Her eyes were misty with the unshed, at about the size of soup plates. "No, Bertie, really there is no hope, none. You must not build dream castles. It can only cause you pain. I love Augustus. He is my man." "And you haven't parted brass rags?" "Of course not." "Then what did he mean by saying serious rift, Madeline and self?" "Oh, that." She laughed, another tinkling, silvery one. "That was nothing. It was all too perfectly silly and ridiculous. Just the weeniest little misunderstanding. I thought I had found him flirting with my cousin Stephanie, and I was silly and jealous. But he explained everything this morning. He was only taking a fly out of her eye." I suppose I might legitimately have been a bit shirty on learning that I had been hauled all the way down here for nothing. But I wasn't. I was amazingly braced. As I've indicated, that telegram of Gussie's had shaken me to my foundations, causing me to fear the worst. And now the all clear had been blown, and I have received absolute inside information, straight from the horse's mouth, that all was hotsy-totsy between this blister and himself. "So everything's all right, is it?" "Everything. I have never loved Augustus more than I do now." "Haven't you, by Jove?" "Each moment I'm with him, his wonderful nature seems to open before me like some lovely flower." "Does it? Egad!" "Every day I find myself discovering some new facet of his extraordinary character. For instance, you have seen him quite lately, have you not?" "Oh, rather. I gave him a dinner at the Drones only the night before last." "I wonder if you noticed any difference in him?" I threw my mind back to the binge in question. As far as I could recollect, Gussie had been the same fish-faced freak I had always known. Difference? No, I don't think so. Of course, at that dinner I hadn't a chance to observe him very closely, subject his character to the final analysis, if you know what I mean. He sat next to me and we talked of this and that. But you know how it is when you're a host. You have all sorts of things to divert your attention. Keeping an eye on the waiters, trying to make the conversation general, heading cat's meat Potter Purbright off from giving his imitation of Beatrice Lilly, 100 little duties, but he seemed to me much the same. What sort of a difference?
An improvement, if such a thing were possible. Have you not sometimes felt in the past, Bertie, that if Augustus had a fault, it was a tendency to be a little timid?
I saw what she meant. Oh, yes, of course, definitely. I remembered something Jeeves had once called Gussie. A sensitive plant, what?
Exactly. You know your Shelley, Bertie.
Oh, am I?
That is what I've always thought him. A sensitive plant, hardly fit for the rough and tumble of life. But recently, in this last week in fact, he has shown, together with that wonderful dreamy sweetness of his, a force of character which I had not suspected that he possessed. He seems completely to have lost his diffidence.
By Jove, yes, I said, remembering. That's right. Do you know, he actually made a speech at that dinner of mine, and a most admirable one. And what is more... I paused. I'd been on the point of saying that, what was more, he had made it from start to finish on orange juice, and not, as had been the case at the Market Snodsbury prize-giving, with about 3 quarts of mixed alcoholic stimulants lapping about inside him. But I saw that the statement might be injudicious. That Market Snodsbury exhibition on the part of the adored object was, no doubt, something which he was trying to forget.
Why, only this morning, she said, he spoke to Roderick Spode quite sharply.
He did?
Yes, they were arguing about something, and Augustus told him to go and boil his head.
Well, well, I said. Naturally, I didn't believe it for a moment. But I mean to say, Roderick Spode, a chap who even in repose would have made an all-in wrestler pause and pick his words. The thing wasn't possible. I saw what had happened, of course. She was trying to give the boyfriend a build-up, and like all girls, was overdoing it. I've noticed the same thing in young wives, when they're trying to kid you that Herbert or George, or whatever the name may be, has hidden depths which the vapid and irreflective observer might overlook. Women never know when to stop on these occasions.
I think that's a general human thing of a certain type, and it's not along gender lines.
Anyway, I remember Mrs. Bingo Little once telling me, shortly after their marriage, that Bingo said poetic things to her about sunsets, his best friends being perfectly well aware, of course, that the old egg never noticed a sunset in his life, and that if he did, by a fluke, ever happen to do so, the only thing he would say about it would be that it reminded him of a slice of roast beef cooked just right. Well, you can't call a girl a liar, so as I say, I said, well, well.
It was the one thing that was needed to make him perfect. Sometimes, Bertie, I ask myself if I am worthy of so rare a soul.
Oh, I wouldn't ask yourself rot like that, I said heartily. Of course you are.
It's sweet of you to say so.
Not a bit. You two fit like pork and beans. Anyone could see that it was a, ideal union. I've known Gussie since we were kids together, and I wish I had a bob for every time I thought to myself that the girl for him was somebody just like you.
Really?
Absolutely. And when I met you, I said, that's the bird. There she spouts. When's the wedding to be?
On the 23rd.
I'd make it earlier.
You think so?
Definitely. Get it over and done with, and then you'll have it off your mind. You can't be married too soon to a chap like Gussie. Great chap, splendid chap. Never met a chap I respected more. They don't often make them like Gussie. One of the fruitiest. She reached out and grasped my hand and pressed it. Unpleasant, of course, but one has to take the rough with the smooth.
Ah, Bertie, always the soul of generosity.
No, rather not. Just saying what I think.
It makes me so happy to feel that all this has not interfered with your affection for Augustus.
I should say not.
So many men in your position might have become embittered.
Silly asses.
But you are too fine for that. You can still say these wonderful things about him.
Oh, rather.
Dear Bertie.
And on this cheery note we parted, she to go messing about on some domestic errand, and I to head for the drawing-room and get a spot of tea. She herself, it appeared, did not take tea, being on a diet. and I had reached the drawing-room and was about to shove open the door, which was ajar, when from the other side there came a voice, and what it was saying was, "So kindly do not talk rot, Spode." There was no possibility of mistake as to whose voice it was. From his earliest years there has always been something distinctive and individual about Gussie's timbre, reminding the hearer partly of an escape of gas from a gas pipe, and partly of a sheep calling to its young in the lambing season. Nor was there any possibility of mistake about what he had said. The words were precisely as I have stated, and to say that I was surprised would be to put it too weakly. I saw now that it was perfectly possible that there might be something, after all, in that wild story of Madeline Bassett's. I mean to say, an Augustus Finknottle who told Roderick Spode not to talk rot was an Augustus Finknottle who might quite well have told him to go and boil his head. I entered the room, marvelling. Except for some sort of dim female abaft the teapot, who looked as if she might be a cousin by marriage or something on that order, only Sir Watkin Bassett, Roderick Spode, and Gussie were present. Gussie was straddling the hearthrug with his legs apart, warming himself at the blaze, which should, one would have said, have been reserved for the trouser seat of the master of the house, and I saw immediately what Madeline Bassett had meant when she said that he had lost his diffidence. Even across the room one could see that, when it came to self-confidence, Mussolini could have taken his correspondence course. He sighted me as I entered, and waved what seemed to me a dashed, patronising hand. Quite the ruddy squire graciously receiving the deputation of tenantry. "Ah, Bertie, so here you are." "Yes." Come in, and have a crumpet." "Thanks. Did you bring that book I asked you to?" "Awfully sorry, I forgot." "Well, of all the muddle-headed asses that ever stepped, you certainly are the worst. Others abide our question, thou art free." And dismissing me with a weary gesture, he called for another potted meat sandwich. I have never been able to look back on my first meal at Totley Towers as among my happiest memories. The cup of tea on arrival at a country house is a thing which, as a rule, I particularly enjoy. I like the crackling logs, the shaded lights, the scent of buttered toast, the general atmosphere of leisured coziness. There is something that seems to speak to the deeps in me in the beaming smile of my hostess and the furtive whisper of my host as he plucks at my elbow and says, "Let's get out of here and go have a whisky and soda in the gun room." It is on such occasions as this, it has often been said, that you catch Bertram Wooster at his very best. But now all sense of bien-être was destroyed by Gussie's peculiar manner, that odd suggestion he conveyed of having bought the place. It was a relief when the gang had finally drifted away, leaving us alone. There were mysteries here which I wanted to probe. I thought it best, however, to begin by taking a second opinion on the position of affairs between himself and Madeline. She had told me that everything was now hunky-dory once more, but it was one of those points on which you cannot have too much assurance. "I saw Madeline just now," I said. "She tells me that you are sweethearts still, correct?" "Quite correct. There was a little temporary coolness about my taking a fly out of Stephanie Bing's eye, and I got a bit panicked and wired you to come down. I thought you might possibly plead. However, no need for that now. I took a strong line and everything is all right. Still, stay a day or two, of course, as you're here." "Thanks. No doubt you will be glad to see your aunt. She arrives tonight, I understand." I could make nothing of this. My Aunt Agatha, I knew, was in a nursing home with jaundice. I had taken her flowers only a couple of days before, and naturally it couldn't be Aunt Dahlia, for she had mentioned nothing to me about any plans for infesting Totley Towers. "Some mistake," I said. "No mistake at all. Madeline showed me the telegram that came from her this morning, asking if she could be put up for a day or two. It was dispatched from London, I noticed, so I suppose she has left Brinkley." I stared. "You aren't talking about my Aunt Dahlia?" "Of course I'm talking about your Aunt Dahlia." "You mean Aunt Dahlia is coming here tonight?" "Exactly." This was nasty news, and I found myself chewing the lower lip a bit in undisguised concern. This sudden decision to follow me to Totley Towers could only mean one thing: that Aunt Dahlia, thinking things over, had become mistrustful of my will to win, and had felt it best to come and stand over me and see that I did not shirk the appointed task. And as I was fully resolved to shirk it, I could envisage some dirty weather ahead. Her attitude towards a recalcitrant nephew would, I feared, closely resemble that which, in the old tally-ho days, she had been wont to adopt towards a hound which refused to go into cover.
Tell me, continued Gussie, what sort of voice is she in these days? I ask because if she's going to make those hunting noises of hers at me during a visit, I shall be compelled to tick her off pretty sharply. I had enough of that sort of thing when I was staying at Brinkley.
I would have liked to go on musing on the unpleasant situation which had arisen, but it seemed to me that I had been given the cue to begin my probe. What's happened to you, Gussie? I asked.
Eh?
Since when have you been like this?
I don't understand you.
Well, to take an instance, saying you're going to tick Aunt Dolly off. At Brinkley you cowered before her like a wet sock. And to take another instance, telling Spode not to talk rot. By the way, what was he talking rot about?
I forget, he talks so much rot.
I wouldn't have the nerve to tell Spode not to talk rot, I said frankly. My candour met with an immediate response.
Well, to tell you the truth, Bertie,
said Gussie, coming clean,
neither would I a week ago.
What happened a week ago?
I had a spiritual rebirth, thanks to Jeeves. There's a chap, Bertie.
Ah.
We were as little children and frightened of the dark, and Jeeves is the wise nurse who takes us by the hand and
switches the light on?
Precisely. Would you care to hear about it?
I assured him that I was all agog. I settled myself in my chair and, putting match to gasper, awaited the inside story. Gussie stood silent for a moment. I could see that he was marshalling his facts. He took off his spectacles and polished them.
A week ago, Bertie,
he began,
my affairs had reached a crisis. I was faced by an ordeal, the mere prospect of which blackened the horizon. I discovered that I would have to make a speech at the wedding breakfast.
Well, naturally.
I know, but for some reason I had not foreseen it, and the news came as a stunning blow. And shall I tell you why I was so overcome by stark horror at the idea of making a speech at the wedding breakfast? It was because Roderick Spode and Sir Watkin Bassett would be in the audience. Do you know Sir Watkin intimately?
Not very. He once fined me £5 at his police court.
Well, you can take it from me that he is a hard nut, and he strongly objects to having me as a son-in-law. For one thing, he would have liked Madeline to marry Spode, who, I may mention, has loved her since she was so high.
Oh, yes, I said, courteously concealing my astonishment that anyone except a certified boob like himself could deliberately love this girl.
Yes, but apart from the fact that she wanted to marry me, he didn't want to marry her. He looks upon himself as a man of destiny, you see, and feels that marriage would interfere with his mission. He takes a line through Napoleon.
I felt that before proceeding further, I must get the lowdown on this Spode. I didn't follow all this man of destiny stuff. How do you mean his mission? Is he someone special?
Don't you ever read the papers? Roderick Spode is the founder and head of the Saviours of Britain, a fascist organisation better known as the Black Shorts. His general idea, if he doesn't get knocked on the head with a bottle in one of the frequent brawls in which he and his followers indulge, is to make himself a dictator.
Well, I'm blowed. I was astounded at my keenness of perception. The moment I had set eyes on Spode, if you remember, I had said to myself, what ho, a dictator. And a dictator he had proved to be. I couldn't have made a better shot if I had been one of those detectives who see a chap walking along the street and deduce that he is a retired manufacturer of poppet valves named Robertson, with a rheumatism in one arm, living at Clapham. Well, I'm dashed. I thought he was something of that sort. That chin, those eyes, and for the matter of that moustache. By the way, when you say shorts, you mean shirts, of course.
No, by the time Spode formed his association, there were no shirts left. He and his adherents wear black shorts.
Footer bags, you mean?
Yes.
How perfectly foul.
Yes.
Bare knees?
Bare knees.
Golly.
Yes.
The thought struck me, so revolting that I nearly dropped my gasper. Does old Bassett wear black shorts?
No, he isn't a member of the Saviours of Britain.
Then how does he come to be mixed up with Spode? I met them going around London like a couple of sailors on shore leave.
Sir Watkin is engaged to be married to his aunt, a Mrs. Wintergreen, widow of the late Colonel H. Wintergreen of Pont Street.
I mused for a moment, reviewing in my mind the scene in the antique bin. When you were standing in the dock, with a magistrate looking at you over his pince-nez, and talking about you as the prisoner Wooster, who have ample opportunity for drinking him in, and what had struck me principally about Sir Watkin Bassett that day at Bosher Street had been his peevishness. In that shop, on the other hand, he had given the impression of a man who has found the bluebird. He had hopped about like a carefree cat on hot bricks, exhibiting the merchandise to Spode with little chirps of,
"I think your Ed would like this, and how about this?"
and so forth, and now a clue to that fizziness had been provided. "Do you know, Gussie," I said, "I've an idea he must have clicked yesterday."
"Quite possibly. However, never mind about that. That is not the point."
"No, I know, but it's interesting."
"No, it isn't."
"Perhaps you're right,"
"Don't let us go wandering off into side issues,"
said Gussie, calling the meeting to order.
"Where was I?"
"I don't know."
"I do. I was telling you that Sir Watkin disliked the idea of having me for a son-in-law." Spode also was opposed to the match, nor did he make any attempt to conceal the fact. He used to come popping out at me from round corners and muttering threats.
"You couldn't have liked that."
I didn't.
"Why did he mutter threats?"
Because, though he would not marry Madeline, even if she would have him, he looks on himself as a sort of knight, watching over her. He keeps telling me that the happiness of that little girl is very dear to him, and if I ever let her down he will break my neck. That is the gist of the threats he utters, and that was one of the reasons why I was a bit agitated when Madeline became distant in her manner on catching me with Stephanie Byng.
"Tell me, Gussie, what were you and Stiffy actually doing?"
I was taking a fly out of her eye.
I nodded. If that was his story, no doubt he was wise to stick to it.
So much for Spode. We now come to Sir Watkin Bassett. At our very first meeting I could see that I was not his dream man.
Me too.
I became engaged to Madeline, as you know, at Brinkley Court. The news of the betrothal was, therefore, conveyed to him by letter, and I imagine that the dear girl must have hauled up her slacks about me in a way that led him to suppose that what he was getting was a sort of cross between Robert Taylor and Einstein. At any rate, when I was introduced to him as the man who was to marry his daughter, he just stared for a moment and said, "What?" incredulously, you know, as if he were hoping that this was some sort of jolly practical joke, and that the real chap would shortly jump out from behind a chair and say, "Boo!" When he at last got onto it that there was no deception, he went off into a corner and sat there for some time, holding his head in his hands. After that, I used to catch him looking at me over the top of his pince-nez. It unsettled me.
I wasn't surprised. I've already alluded to the effect that over the top of the pince-nez look of Bassett's had on me, and I could see that, if directed at Gussie, it might conceivably, quite conceivably, have stirred the old egg up a good deal.
He also sniffed, and when he learned from Madeline that I was keeping newts in my bedroom, he said something very derogatory, under his breath, but I heard him.
"You got the troop with you, then?"
"Of course. I'm in the middle of a very delicate experiment. An American professor has discovered that the full moon influences the love life of several undersea creatures, including one species of fish, 2 starfish groups, 8 kinds of worms, and a ribbon-like seaweed called dictyota. The moon will be full in 2 or 3 days, and I want to find out if it affects the love life of newts too."
"But what is the love life of newts, if you boil it right down? Didn't you tell me once that they just waggled their tails at one another in the mating season?"
"Quite correct."
I shrugged my shoulders. "Well, all right, if they like it, but it's not my idea of molten passion. So old Bassett didn't approve of the dumb chums."
"No, he didn't approve of anything about me. It made things most difficult and disagreeable. Add Spode, and you will understand why I was beginning to get thoroughly rattled. And then, out of a blue sky, they sprang it on me that I would have to make a speech at a wedding breakfast to an audience, as I said before, of which Roderick Spode and Sir Watkin Bassett would form a part."
He paused and swallowed convulsively, like a Pekingese taking a pill.
"I'm a shy man, Bertie. Diffidence is the price I pay for having a hypersensitive nature. And you know how I feel about making speeches under any conditions. The mere idea appalls me. When you lugged me to that prize-giving affair at Market Snodsbury, the thought of standing on a platform, faced by a mob of pimply boys, filled me with a panicked terror. It haunted my dreams. You can imagine, then, what it was like for me to have to contemplate that wedding breakfast. To the task of haranguing a flock of aunts and cousins, I might have steeled myself. I don't say it would have been easy, but I might have managed it. but to get up with Spode on one side of me and Sir Watkin Bassett on the other, I didn't see how I was going to face it. And then out of the night that covered me, black as the pit from pole to pole, there shone a tiny gleam of hope. I thought of Jeeves.
His hand moved upwards, and I think his idea was to bare his head reverently. The project, however, was rendered null and void by the fact that he hadn't a hat on.
I thought of Jeeves, he repeated, and I took the train to London and placed my problem before him. I was fortunate to catch him in time.
How do you mean in time?
Before he left England.
He isn't leaving England.
He told me that you and he were starting almost immediately on one of those round-the-world cruises.
Oh no, that's all off. I didn't like the scheme.
Does Jeeves say it's all off?
No, but I do.
Oh?
He looked at me rather oddly, and I thought he was going to say something more on the subject, but he only gave a rummy sort of short laugh and resumed his narrative.
Well, as I say, I went to Jeeves and I put the facts before him. I begged him to try to find some way of getting me out of this frightful situation in which I was enmeshed, assuring him that I would not blame him if he failed to do so, because it seemed to me, after some days of reviewing the matter, that I was beyond human aid. And you would scarcely credit this, Bertie. I hadn't got more than halfway through the glass of orange juice with which he had supplied me when he solved the whole thing. I wouldn't have believed it possible. I wonder what that brain of his weighs.
A good bit, I fancy. He eats a lot of fish. So it was a winner, was it, this idea?
It was terrific. He approached the matter from the psychological angle. In the final analysis, he said, disinclination to speak in public is due to fear of one's audience.
Well, I could have told you that.
Yes, but he indicated how this might be cured. We do not, he said, fear those whom we despise. The thing to do, therefore, is to cultivate a lofty contempt for those who will be listening to one.
How?
Quite simple. You fill your mind with scornful thoughts about them. You keep saying to yourself, think of that pimple on Smith's nose. Consider Jones's flapping ears. Remember the time Robertson got hauled up before the beak for travelling first class with a third-class ticket? Don't forget you once saw the child Brown being sick at a children's party, and so on, so that when you are called upon to address Smith, Jones, Robinson and Brown, they've lost their sting. You dominate them.
I pondered on this. I see. Well, yes, it sounds good, Gussie, but would it work in practice?
My dear chap, it works like a charm. I've tested it. You recall my speech at that dinner of yours?
I started. You were despising us.
Certainly I was. Thoroughly.
What, me?
You and Freddie Widgeon and Bingo Little and Catchmeat Potter Purbright and Barmy Fotheringay Phipps and all the rest of those present. Worms, I said to myself. What a crew, I said to myself. There's old Bertie, I said to myself. Golly, I said to myself, what I know about him, with the result that I played on you all as a lot of stringed instruments and achieved an outstanding triumph.
I must say I was conscious of a certain chagrin. A bit thick, I mean, being scorned by a goof like Gussie, and that at a moment when he had been bursting with one's meat and orange juice. But soon more generous emotions prevailed. After all, I told myself, the great thing, the fundamental thing to which all considerations must yield, was to get this Finknottle safely under the wire and off on his honeymoon. And but for this advice of Jeeves, the muttered threats of Roderick Spode and the combined sniffing and looking over the top of the pince-nez of Sir Watkin Bassett might well have been sufficient to destroy his morale entirely and cause him to cancel the wedding arrangements and go off hunting newts in Africa. Well, yes, I said, I see what you mean. But dash it, Gussie, conceding the fact that you might scorn Barmy Fotheringay Phipps and Catchmeat Potter Purbright, and stretching the possibilities a bit, me, you couldn't despise Spode.
Couldn't I? He laughed a light laugh. I did it on my head, and Sir Watkin Bassett too. I tell you, Bertie, I approached this wedding breakfast without a tremor. I am gay, confident, debonair. There will be none of that blushing and stammering and twiddling the thumbs and plucking at the tablecloth which you see in most bride rooms on these occasions. I shall look these men in the eye and make them wilt. As for the aunts and cousins, I shall have them rolling in the aisles. The moment Jeeves spoke those words, I settled down to think of all the things about Roderick Spode and Sir Watkin Bassett which exposed them to the just contempt of their fellow men. I could tell you 50 things about Sir Watkin alone, which would make you wonder how such a moral and physical blot on the English scene could have been tolerated all these years. I wrote them down in a notebook.
You wrote them down in a notebook?
A small leather-covered notebook. I bought it in the village.
I confess that I was a bit agitated. Even though he presumably kept it under lock and key, the mere existence... Ooh, I'm about to run out of time. Rejoin me in a moment. Or rejoin me on Facebook. I confess that I was a bit agitated. Even though he presumably kept it under lock and key, the mere existence of such a book made one uneasy. One did not care to think what the upshot and outcome would be were it to fall into the wrong hands. A brochure like that would be dynamite. Where do you keep it?
In my breast pocket. Here it is. Oh no, it isn't. That's funny, said Gussie. I must have dropped it somewhere.
Dun, dun, dun. We will continue with chapter 4. Maybe tomorrow. I might not be able to do a reading tomorrow. If not, then we may continue with chapter 4 on Sunday. Let me see, I think... Well, yes. We'll see. Let me know if you want me to carry on with the Code of the Woosters. We may or may not be online tomorrow. If we're not going to be on for tomorrow, then I will post shortly before 8:30. So pencil it in, but I have some other things going on before that I might not be done in time. See you tomorrow or see you Sunday.